This video is about hitting a wall in asana. Specifically, it's about bakasana B, which is a posture in the intermediate series. But there are a few others throughout the method where there's so much that's asked of you in terms of whole body awareness and possibly reprogramming. And you're either going to get it or you don't, where you can hit walls like this. And, really any posture can offer us this. But some obvious ones are Bhujapidasana, kurmasana, Kurundavasana, handstands, bunch of stuff in advanced. Advanced series is all about it. In February, I made a whole little installment on bakasana B, and I threw it out. Then I circled back in March, tried the same thing, threw it out. And the reason for this reticence is that I'm so hesitant to give the shallow version of the practice, which is like the tips and tricks. And you don't do this to me, but it's something that does happen where I'll be approached and people will ask me for what's the one thing that I need to know to do X posture? That kind of orientation to postures as achievements or things that you're going to nail or whatever. And obviously we don't relate with the postures as anything more than koans, so it doesn't happen here. But still, you might hit a wall at some point when you get to one of these crazy movements that, again, you either get it or you don't. And you could approach these postures as okay, I need to remember one thing. I need to figure out one thing. I need to get the teacher to tell me one thing, and that's going to unlock it. Sometimes, actually, that can get you the posture, but it totally denies you this deeper thing that happens, where you get to look at your mind and you get to look at your conditioning and just be at that wall for a while. And I was thinking for February that I'd use the conceptual framework around implicit knowledge to try to highlight this, and it really didn't work. It's frustrating. And at this point, what I've arrived on is just this vague idea that there's a je ne sais quoi factor. That when there's some posture that presents this aporíā, it's just complete lack of conceptual machinery, that if you be in that aporíā, that I don't know what, sometimes you have this opportunity to learn a new way to learn. And this is what I do not want to deny you by the tips and tricks approach to asana, if I can be strong enough, right? There are lots of tips and tricks that really do work and that you really do need to do. And yet the being at the wall, sometimes what I find people discover is a whole new non-verbal, non-conceptual beingness around these crazy postures, that all of that is behind the threshold of language. What often happens when we do go for the tips and the tricks is what we're doing is we're affirming all of your other conditioning. So say bakasana B, I'm the one thing you need to do is point your toes and then you'll have it nailed, right? What I'm doing is affirming all the other actual methodology and practice in the body. And the one tiny thing, which is actually the last, almost least important aspect of the totality that pops up over the threshold of awareness, is this last little thing, point your toes. When really it's the bottom of the iceberg that is what is really important about that technique. All of the movement ways that remain unarticulated and remain taken for granted, right? So this other way is kind of we're going to pull even that last tip and trick down into that ocean of wholeness. And there's a complete nonverbal, isolated experience of the posture that's just from this place of wholeness, your animal intelligence, right? So this may be a little arcane when it comes to actually sticking bakasana B, but it's the reason for my reticence. And I just think there's so much on a real deep level, on like the integrative level, to be found by being with these postures that present like the Je Ne Sais Quoi. In the winter, I had this wonderful conversation with the other teachers in the shala about bakasana B and like what they felt like when they actually cross that threshold from the not getting to the getting. And usually we do have one thing that appears like in the gestalt of that whole experience. If I didn't get it, I didn't get it, now I get it. That's like, oh, that was that last little piece that like put it together. And it's super interesting because one of them just said, yeah, I had to trust my shoulders. Which that is a kind of technique, right? But it's a sort of technique that has that attitude of wholeness and that really shows how the practice is reconditioning so much of our like emotional body and our subconscious programming, the Vijnana Kosha, as well as, telling you what to do with your arms. So I like that a lot. I like trust your shoulders. And as we went into what does that look like? How does that feel like? One of the things that they highlighted was that bending the arms really helps get into the way of load bearing in the shoulders that Bakasana B is asking you for, especially right before you land. If you bend the arms before you land, or bend the arms right before you jump back, sometimes it can show you some things about habitual load bearing in the shoulders that maybe up until that point have served you. But once you get to Bakasana B, no way. Let's talk about Bakasana B as it relates to other postures in the program. All of Ashtanga is real holographic. So you know that when you're learning primary, I emphasize massively these vinyasas from Bhujapidasana and Kurmasana, especially those exits. There's a really unique experience of kind of pulling the body from the hip flexors and from the pelvis when you're moving out of Bhujapidasana and Kurmasana that is reflected again when you get to Bakasana B, and once you get to advanced or the end of intermediate, in learning to take handstands when you jump into a handstand from both legs. So if any of those links in that chain, the real exact vinyasas in primary in those crux postures, or Bakasana B, or if you're in advanced, jumping to handstands with two legs is not there, all of this, that's all talking to each other. It's a kind of, frankly, implicit knowledge that builds over time right here in the sort of middle of these series. So that's my first suggestion for those of you who are in the Je Ne Sais Quoi in Bakasana B, is really, really look at the fine-tuned sort of tiny fixes and corrections that you can do as you're pulling into Bakasana from Bhujapidasana and Kurmasana in your primary. Really correcting instead of fixing. So holding your balance instead of coming back down to the ground and then getting it again, but holding your balance and sorting it out while you're still in the air tends to force you into a deeper place. So that is my recommendation as the preparatory work. Then I do want to mention that there's something usually to be understood about each posture by going deep into the vinyasa, the actual vinyasa count. So if you're taking lead intermediate, you know that the vinyasa count for Bakasana B, there's actually a really important key there. So the vinyasa count for A is just Sapta, jump, prepare. So you get to come down into Pashasana position, then Ashtau up, hold for 5. And Nava is just you jump back to Chaturanga, right? So it's kind of the bones of Bakasana. But in B, they not only ask you to jump in, but you also have to jump up to jump out. And I've been stopping you there because very often, if you don't know the correct vinyasa, what happens is, you'll take a few attempts at bakasana B, maybe you'll get it, but then you'll jump out the same way you did in A. Reverse engineer this thing. Get the vinyasa correct, and you will be able to jump into the posture. And so the exit from that vinyasa is first you jump in, you hold for 5, right? Then there's an inhale up out of bakasana, then you exhale to chaturanga. So you might not, if you're not landing A, you might not actually inhale and see any daylight between your knees and your arms, right? But work on that rhythm and on all the interior feelings of the as if you're going to inhale off the arms and exhale back. The same way you did when you were really getting precise about the inhale out of Bhujapidasana and the inhale out of Supta Karmasana, where you're allowed to leave the knees on the arms. There's a posture in advanced where you have to do a one-legged bakasana with the other one like floating in the air, right? So at some point you will have to sort this out on a deep embodied level. So these are 2 little like news you can use bits. It's like working with the bending of the arms, especially at the moment of landing, and really, really, really understanding the way that the vinyasa applies to the entry. The vinyasa out is the vinyasa in, right? And for those of you who didn't learn this posture in Ann Arbor, I'm going to say a few things about making it a little easier on yourself to begin to land. So there is a deep pattern, and I think it has to do with Sapta jump to stand in our Surya Namaskar, where at first when people learn this posture, they'll keep the hips really high. So we want to rethink this at the beginning. Eventually, lift your hips high, come down, and like nestle your knees into your armpits. Great. But at the beginning, you're going to treat the hips like a little hovercraft that are going to stay at the same distance from the floor through the entire movement, okay? So the gaze really helps. Usually you want your gaze out here. And so I'm going to resist that tendency to want to lift my hips and keep them high. I'm going to keep them down the whole time. And instead of working the knees right into the triceps, which, eventually that shelf of your strong triceps is just the place where you set down your knees. We're going to work with the knees kind of the way that you did when you learned the exit from Bhujapidasana, where you're like, oh, I'm going to suck this in and up and around, and then figure out the placement in the armpits, right? So that's what I'm saying, is that the knees are going to kind of land here on the outsides of the arms, and I'm going to use my inner thighs to catch. This is not where you'll be in the long run, but if you are in the very common habit of landing on your pointed toes, to deprogram these sort of those body hexes that is no longer going to serve once you get to this place, trying to catch the outside of the arms can give you another place to land rather than that cheat of putting your toes down. So I'm going to keep the toes pointed, hips low, catch the outside of the arm as the kind of baby steps to deprogram some of the underlying movement patterns that can get in people's way and prevent you from ever figuring this out. You have to let those go. Okay? So, hips low. I'm going to look forward. I'm going to bring my knees right here. Okay? Watch my hips. They're not going to come high. What does this accomplish? It enables me to let go of the desire to put my toes down. It also, that bit from the other, the teacher discussion, like learning to trust the shoulders, transferring weight onto the shoulders, rather than trying to lift the hips up and come down and pray. This is like a little baby step that deprograms some of that stuff. So again, watch the height of my hips, the point of the toes, and the way that I'm going to catch the outside of the arm instead of trying to place the kneecap here. And notice I'm going to inhale. Okay. It's basically a weight transfer. Lots of things have to progress from there, where eventually you're in a full Adho Mukha Svanasana, right? It's a long, deep inhale, and you just land here. But that internal, that sense of like pulling the legs to the torso while in motion, while having stable, strong shoulders, well, you know how to do that from primary series. You're doing a much more difficult version of it here. And then you get to handstands and beyond. And that same sense of hinging from the hips and pulling the legs to the torso while the shoulders are strong and stable happens all over again in maybe a slightly even more sort of emotionally challenging space. So those of you who are coming up against some weird, deep embodied fear about coming to handstand with both legs, this is the place to stop and look and make sure that you're really engaging here and figuring out the weight transfer onto your shoulders in like an intuitive way that trains you to simply rotate it another few degrees into handstand with the same kind of confidence. So I feel like I've kind of had it both ways here, right? I said like, this is a je ne sais quoi. And yes, there are some elements of good technique that can help you pass the wall. But please don't let that take away from the dedication to having like a whole body consciousness experience of this really deep technique. The kind of consciousness that doesn't reduce to like the one tip or the one trick that gets it done, but really is a totality of conscious movement where the consciousness is really, you're making deliberate, mindful choices all at once in a way that's like there's not even a person making the choices anymore. It's a thing that's happening sort of on its own as a whole intelligence. I don't know if this makes any sense. Maybe I'll throw this one out too. Maybe I'll let you see it. I'm not doing a super clear job. But yeah, that at least gets you the nuts and bolts level of the bakasana B. All right. See you soon.